Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and this is the final wrap-up video for Jane Austen July. I had a lot of fun this July reading Jane Austen's work, as well as works about Jane Austen and retellings and all of that good stuff. It was a fantastic month, and I am very grateful to the hosts for putting on such a great event here on BookTube. I have 4 books to talk to you about for my week 4 of Jane Austen July. One of them is Mansfield Park. Now, I read Mansfield Park in the first week of July, but I saved talking about it because I was going to do a dedicated review to this book. And this book deserves a dedicated review, but I realized I didn't need to do a separate video. I'm just going to include it in this video. This was a reread for me. I love Mansfield Park. I've been thinking about how I would rank Jane Austen's books, and that is so very difficult. But Mansfield Park would, I think, rank kind of in the middle for me. I really enjoyed it. It's not my favorite, but it's also not my least favorite. So the story of Fanny Price, who goes to live with her cousins at Mansfield Park. It's a great story. It's got great characters. A really interesting plot. I mean, it's good. It's classic Jane Austen, and there was a few things in here that I wanted to share with you, some thoughts that I had this time as I was reading it. First of all, one of the comments that I read in the Goodreads group was talking about the theme of home and place in this book, that's an important theme. It gets talked about a lot, the concept of home, where you feel at home, and your place at home, at the place that you feel that is home. And so there was a couple of quotes here that I wanted to share with you. The first one here, Fanny is talking with Miss Crawford, and Miss Crawford says, "I am conscious of being far better reconciled to a country residence than I had ever expected to be. I can even suppose it pleasant to spend half the year in the country under certain circumstances. Very pleasant. An elegant, moderate-sized house in the center of family connections, continual engagements among them, commanding the first society in the neighborhood, looked up to perhaps as leading it even more than those of larger fortune, and turning from the cheerful round of such amusements to nothing worse than a tete-a-tete with the person one feels most agreeable in the world. There is nothing frightful in such a picture, is there, Miss Price? One need not envy the new Mrs. Rushworth with such a home as that." This is referring to Fanny when she is back at Portsmouth. "She was at home, but alas, it was not such a home. She had not such a welcome as—" She checked herself. She was unreasonable. What right had she to be of importance to her family? She could have none, so long lost sight of. William's concerns must be dearest. They always had been, and he had every right. Yet to have so little said or asked about herself, to have scarcely an inquiry made after Mansfield, it did pain her to have Mansfield forgotten. The friends who had done so much, the dear friends. But here, one subject swallowed up all the rest. Perhaps it must be so. The destination of the thrust must be now preeminently interesting. A day or two might show the difference. She only was to blame. Yet she thought it would not have been so at Mansfield. No, in her uncle's house there would have been a consideration of times and seasons, a regulation of subject, a propriety, an attention towards everybody which there was not here. It's an interesting thought then. She's comparing her two homes. And then just a couple pages on, William was gone, and the home he had left her in was— Fanny could not conceal it from herself. In almost every respect, the very reverse of what she could have wished. It was the abode of noise, disorder, and impropriety. Nobody was in their right place. Nothing was done as it ought to be. She could not respect her parents as she had hoped. And finally, one more. Again, this is Fanny. Her eagerness, her impatience, her longings to be with them were such as to bring a line or two of Cowper's Tirocinium forever before her. Quote, with what intense desire she wants her home, unquote, was continually on her tongue, as the truest description of a yearning which she could not suppose any schoolboy's bosom to feel more keenly. When she had been coming to Portsmouth, she had loved to call it her home, had been fond of saying that she was going home. The word had been very dear to her, and so it still was, but it must be applied to Mansfield. That was now the home. Portsmouth was Portsmouth. Mansfield was home. All right, and then a couple other thoughts about Mr. and Mrs. Miss Crawford, Henry and Mary Crawford. In the book, it seems really that they represent the urban, whereas Fanny definitely represents the rural. They represent the future and the embodiment of those ideals that disrupt Fanny and Edmund's ideals and values. It's an interesting thought as you read about the book and you read specifically about those four people. There's another interesting thing, the relationship I found interesting to read about, the relationship between Fanny and Mary. I thought was really very interesting. They had, I mean, they would say they were friends, and Mary would say that they were friends, but the way Mary treated Fanny really was really not much really that of a friend. So here's just a few more quotes. So this is Mary's thoughts about Edmund. She felt it to be so, though she had not foreseen and could hardly understand it. For he was not pleasant by any common rule. He talked no nonsense, he paid no compliments, his opinions were unbending, his attentions tranquil and simple. There was a charm, perhaps, in his sincerity, his steadiness, his integrity, which Miss Crawford might be equal to feel, though not equal to discuss with herself. She did not think very much about it, however. He pleased her for the present. She liked to have him near her. It was enough. So also interesting, the relationship between Edmund and Mary Crawford. And then just a little further on, Fanny is thinking about that relationship. She was a little surprised that he could spend so many hours with Miss Crawford and not see more of the sort of fault which he had already observed, and of which she was almost always reminded by a something of the same nature whenever she was in her company. And then Miss Crawford again. My dear Miss Price, said Miss Crawford, as soon as she was at all within hearing, I am come to make my own apologies for keeping you waiting, but I have nothing in the world to say for myself. I knew it was very late, and that I was behaving extremely ill, and therefore, if you please, you must forgive me. Selfishness must always be forgiven, you know, because there is no hope of a cure. It's quotes like that that really made me think this time around that Mary is the villain of the piece, not Henry. Henry's not great, but Mary is definitely the worst. It was a very proper wedding. The bride was elegantly dressed. The two bridesmaids were duly inferior. Her father gave her away. Her mother stood with salts in her hands, expecting to be agitated. Her aunt tried to cry, and the service was impressively read by Dr. Grant. I love that. Her aunt tried to cry. All right, so again, Fanny and Mary. Such was the origin of the sort of intimacy which took place between them within the first fortnight of the Miss Bertram's going away, an intimacy resulting principally from Miss Crawford's desire of something new, and which had little reality in Fanny's feelings. Miss Crawford, untouched and inattentive, had nothing to say, and Fanny, perceiving it, brought back her own mind to what she thought must interest. Very telling right there of Mary's character, untouched and inattentive. And then we need to talk about Mrs. Norris, because Mrs. Norris is awful, and the way she treats Fanny is horrific, and the fact that she was allowed to get away with it for as long as she did, and the reason, like, why she feels that she needs to browbeat Fanny so much and always put her in her place, is interesting to think about, and I'm not entirely sure why she felt she needed to do that. Mrs. Norris fetched breath and went on again. The nonsense and folly of people stepping out of their rank and trying to appear above themselves makes me think it right to give you a hint, Fanny, now that you are going into company without any of us, and I do beseech and entreat you not to be putting yourself forward and talking and giving your opinions as if you were one of your cousins, as if you were dear Mrs. Rushworth or Julia. That will never do, believe me. Remember, wherever you are, you must be the lowest and last. And though Miss Crawford is in a manner at home at the parsonage, you are not to be taking place of her. And as to coming away at night, you are to stay just as long as Edmund chooses. Leave him to settle that. So it's so interesting. I wonder if, like, she's protesting too much, that some of these things are things that maybe she does herself, because Fanny is never the kind that would try to take someone else's place or put herself forward. Definitely not. And then again, from Miss Crawford's thoughts, the assurance of Edmund's being so soon to take orders, coming upon her like a blow that had been suspended, and still hoped uncertain and at a distance, was felt with resentment and mortification. She was very angry with him. She had thought her influence more. She had begun to think of him. She felt that she had, with great regard, with almost decided intentions. But she would now meet him with his own cool feelings. It was plain that he could have no serious views, no true attachment, by fixing himself in a situation which he must know she would never stoop to. She would learn to match him in his indifference. She would henceforth admit his attentions without any idea beyond immediate amusement. If he could so command his affections, her should do her no harm. And then finally, about Fanny's character. Had she ever given way to bursts of delight, it must have been then, for she was delighted. But her happiness was of a quiet, deep, heart-swelling sort. And though never a great talker, she was always more inclined to silence when feeling most strongly. And then the very end, I love this description at the very end. I purposely abstained from dates on this occasion, that everyone may be at liberty to fix their own, aware that the cure of unconquerable passions and the transfer of unchanging attachments must vary much as to time in different people. I only entreat everyone to believe that exactly at the time when it was quite natural that it should be so, and not a week earlier, Edmund did cease to care about Miss Crawford and became as anxious to marry Fanny as Fanny herself could desire. So that's just a few thoughts from Mansfield Park. I have a few more for you, however, from this book that I also read, which is Speaking of Jane Austen by Sheila Kaye-Smith and J.B. Stern. This was written in 1944, and it's just two people who love Jane Austen, and these are some thoughts that they have. I didn't agree with everything that they said in this book, but I did find it interesting. There was a whole chapter called The Mansfield Park Quartet, written by J.B. Stern. And in this chapter, she gives her reasons for why she thinks Fanny should have married Henry and Edmund should have married Mary, which was a very interesting chapter. I did not agree with all of her arguments, but it was an interesting chapter to read. Here's a quote from her. Married to Henry and in daily association with him, Fanny must have benefited more than from anything Edmund could have taught her. Except that he was conceited and she humble, Edmund was too like herself. Crawford, however, could have assisted her to mental flexibility, a lighter touch on life, a wider tolerance, less dismay on almost every possible occasion. The man was not rubbish. Fundamentally, he had plenty of character and strength of purpose, better stuff on the whole than his sister Mary, though she also had her excellencies, mainly her unwavering affection for him and her swift partisan partisan spirit in the right cause, which prompted her firmly to move away from Mrs. Norris when that lady insulted Fanny in public about her dependence and poverty. So that's some interesting thoughts there about the Mansfield Quartet. Here is another quote from them about Mansfield Park. And how is it, as Edmund's judgment was shown forming Fanny's from the beginning, as he was older and much wiser than Fanny, and his integrity above reproach, that his verdict on Henry Crawford as the right husband for his little cousin was not regarded by her as more valuable? It's an interesting question, right? Interesting question. Then in a chapter on the clergyman, they do talk a lot about Mansfield Park, and they talk about the evangelical revival, which was happening at the time that Jane Austen was writing Mansfield Park, which could account for some of her descriptions of the clergyman. But in this chapter, the argument was made that the evangelical revival accounted for Fanny and Edmund's character in the book. The fact that they are a little more serious, maybe priggish is a word that would get used a lot. The fact that they were both so against the theatricals, all of that could be accounted for by this evangelical revival. The author of this chapter said, although I see Mansfield Park standing out of line with the other, altogether, I see Mansfield Park standing out of line with the other novels. There is a something which makes it different, a something which is not the same as that which makes a difference in persuasion. So that's, that's again an interesting thought. And then, I am more favorably inclined to Fanny than many readers, though even to me it seems strange that Jane Austen liked her best of all her heroines. One has to be continually reminding oneself that her upbringing at Mansfield was of the very kind most calculated to foster an inferiority complex. Otherwise, her extreme diffidence and humility might strike a hypocritical note. And then one more. Henry Crawford I like very much better than his author would allow. His faults are all superficial, and probably would have disappeared on his marriage to a girl like Fanny. But I cannot agree with J.B. Stern in thinking that Jane Austen ever intended to end the story that way. Apart from the fact that the novel is not impulsively written and gives no sign of the author having changed her mind at any point in its construction, such an ending would have created more problems than it could solve. It would presumably have involved the marriage of Mary and Edmund, and I know that Jane liked Edmund, though not, I think, quite blindly, and disliked Miss Crawford. Such marriages may be made in modern fiction, but not in the fiction of 1806. Unless she had deliberately created Edmund in the spirit of Wickham or Willoughby and designed a retributively unhappy marriage for him, she would never have let him pair with a woman so very likely to make him miserable. For I do not think that Mary would have improved on marriage like her brother. Her faults are fundamental and very treacherous. She would have made Edmund's life a burden. So, as he is obviously the hero of the book, the formulas of novel construction, which were mathematically observed in Jane Austen's day, would not have allowed him to marry her. So, speaking of Jane Austen, this was a really, really interesting book. I enjoyed, they delved into some of the minutiae, let's say, of the books. So there were chapters on the larger events of the world, the Napoleon, the French Revolution, etc., being largely ignored in her novels and why that was. There was a chapter on Austen's chumps, which I loved. I thought that was great. They are endearing, a little vague, ingenuous, deeply earnest in their statements, and deeply honest. We love them. And so she talked about Mr. Woodhouse, Harriet Smith, Isabella Knightley, Lady Bertram, Mrs. Dashwood, and Mrs. Allen. Mrs. Allen is from Northanger Abbey. There is a chapter on the lack of description regarding dress for women in the novels, and also a description of what they ate. So there was a lot of talk about dinners, but no actual description of what they ate. And these authors are very curious and would love to have had more information about that. There was the chapter about the Mansfield Quartet, a chapter on country life and kind of how people would have spent their time in the country, education for girls, clergymen, characters who are failures. That was an interesting chapter. The characters that they believed that were failures. Colonel Brandon, for one, Eleanor Tilney, Lady Catherine, Mary Bennet, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, Lady Russell. And then there was a very interesting chapter on characters that are only mentioned in the books, and speculating on their attitude toward those characters who mention them. So for example, Miss Andrews in Northanger Abbey, Isabella Thorpe mentions Miss Andrews. Or Charles Maddox in Mansfield Park, Aunt Hayter in Persuasion, Mrs. Perry in Emma, Colonel Forster in Pride and Prejudice, the Doctor in Sense and Sensibility, that the two Miss Steeles meet on the carriage on their journey, Mrs. Partridge from Emma, who was a friend of Mrs. Elton's, and then Miss Owens from Mansfield Park. That one was a really interesting chapter. Okay, and so just a few quotes then from this book. Quote, Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, had lived 21 years in the world with very little to vex or distress her. Unquote. I was caught by the very words that caught my present collaborator a few years later. There is a magic in that opening phrase of Emma, a magic that it would be hard to define and which probably charms only Jane addicts, but with them is truly potent. And I agree. I love the opening sentence of Emma. And then a description about what this book is about. This is not a book about Jane Austen, nor even about her novels from a purely literary point of view, but about the people in the novels, their characters, their motives, their ways, and their doings. One of the chapters towards the end has a quiz and then just some odds and ends that they call them. So here's an example. Why did Mr. Knightley not go to Miss Taylor's wedding? It seems odd that he should not have been present at the marriage of such an old friend, marrying a man, moreover, who was another friend of his. We are given no hint that his absence was on essential business and that he came back on the evening of the day itself. He came from London, only 16 miles away, so could surely have hastened his return and been in time for the ceremony. It is a point which is not even raised in the novel, but I think it needs explaining. The same applies in a less degree to Mrs. Elton's absence from the Woodhouse Knightley wedding, for the particulars of which she had to rely on her husband. Interesting thought. And here's another one. Jane Austen's Chamber of Horrors. Mrs. Elton, John Thorpe, Mrs. Norris, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Mr. Collins. Any other candidates? J.B. Stern offers Mr. Price and Sir Walter Elliot. Who would you put in Jane Austen's Chamber of Horrors? I think that's a good question. And then finally, in the final chapter, I have also found great moral support, especially during air raids. So that's a good reminder that this book was written during World War II. In the following dialogue. Mrs. Bennet. If it were not for the entail, I should not mind it. Mr. Bennet. What should you not mind? Mrs. Bennet. I should not mind anything at all. Mr. Bennet. Let us be thankful that you are preserved from a state of such insensibility. So I really enjoyed reading this one. Okay, I also read Unmarriageable by Soniah Kamal. This is Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. And this was interesting. This was an interesting modern day retelling of Pride and Prejudice. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. And I've come to the conclusion that modern day retellings just don't work for me of Jane Austen. And even in, say, cultures where the values are a little closer to what they would have been in Jane Austen's times, the stories just don't quite work. And in this one of the things that drove me crazy, and Emily from The Redhead is Reading made a comment about this, saying that she had read this book and had thought the same thing, was for a main character who loved Pride and Prejudice so much, how did she not see any of the parallels happening in her own life? Especially because the man that she had the love-hate relationship with, or whatever you want to call it, was called Darcy. Like, it was, yeah, that was a bit, maybe a bit unbelievable. And then I read the third in the Mr. and Mrs. Darcy series. This is North by Northanger by Carrie, Bebris, or The Shades of Pemberley. And I love this one. This one was so good. So Mr. and Mrs. Darcy are at Pemberley, and Mrs. Darcy is in the family way, and they find a letter written by Darcy's mother, and she wrote it just before she gave birth to Georgiana, and we all know that she died giving birth to Georgiana. And in that letter was written to the future Mrs. Darcy, to her son's wife. And in it talks about a family heirloom that she had lost, that she was trying to find, and that she was hoping that the future Mrs. Darcy might find. So it was just an intriguing letter. The two of them then go to Bath, and while there, receive a letter from Captain Tilney talking about how their mothers knew each other and he would like to meet them, and would they come to Northanger Abbey for a visit. So again, an intriguing letter. Now, they go to Northanger Abbey, and it is a weird, weird visit. There are hardly any servants around, and the housekeeper, who is really the only servant that they see, does not behave the way they expect a housekeeper to behave. She's a little bit weird. They don't meet Captain Tilney the first time there. They're told not to wander around at the Abbey. And then Captain Tilney, when they do finally meet him, he's all bandaged up. He's been injured somehow in some battle or something. And all he wants to talk about is the mothers and letters that they wrote and stuff like that. Well, it's a weird visit for them all around, because even their own servants now have disappeared. They can't find them. They don't know where they are. And whenever they ask the housekeeper, she has some vague thought of where they are. So their trunks are never unpacked. They have to dress themselves. It's just a weird visit. And Captain Tilney is being really, really weird. And Elizabeth doesn't like it at all. And so they leave the very next day, even though the weather's not great. And so they stop in the nearest town, and they decide to stay the night and then continue their journey later. They just wanted to get out of Northanger Abbey. Well, the next morning, as they're having breakfast, they get a knock on the door, and it's a local magistrate who has questions for them about their visit to Northanger Abbey, why they were there, and he finally admits that he received an anonymous letter claiming that the Darcys stole some diamonds from Northanger Abbey. Well, of course, the two of them are horrified by such a accusation, but he won't go away. He's taking it seriously, and so he says that he is going to search their belongings. And in Darcy's walking stick, it turns out that there is a hole kind of in the middle. You can take off the handle or something, and the diamonds are inside. And so Darcy is arrested, and they have to figure out what's going on. And so yeah, this one was really good, figuring out what was happening, and how they were going to clear their name. It was really good. I really did enjoy this. I am really enjoying the series, and definitely looking forward to reading the next one in the series. So that is it. That is what I read for the final week in Jane Austen July. I would love to chat with you in the comment section down below. Have you read Mansfield Park? What are some of your thoughts on Mansfield Park? Also, Who would you put in Jane Austen's Chamber of Horrors? I think that's a great question. And I will see you for another video soon. Bye.